بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نبدأ محاضرتنا لهذا اليوم في مادة General Anatomy. موضوعنا اليوم هو the cranial fossa. حقيقة cranial fossa أو تسمى cranial cavity. It's the same space within the skull's bone. The inside view of cranium is known as cranial cavity. The cranial cavity contains the brain and its surrounding meninges, portion of the cranial nerves, arteries, veins, and venous sinuses. We discuss in this lecture the structure of the cranium, the arrangement of the cranial fossa, the correlation of this fossa. The architecture of the cranium. The cranium consists of the calibraria, mean the skull bones, and the facial skeleton. The cranium, it is the same of the skull. The skull call it the cranium. The cranium consists two portions. The anterior portion is the blue ring, is the facial bone, and the posterior portion is the above ring is called the cranial bone. So the only movable bone in the skull is the mandible. The mandible and the cranium is called its skull. The number of bone of the skull. We have 8 bones form the calibraria, I mean the cranial bones, and 14 bones forming the facial skeleton. So both of them have 22 bones that forming the skulls. The bones that make up the cranial cavity. The cranial cavity is contained by the frontal, parietal, sphenoidal, temporal, occipital bones, and in part of the ethmoidal bone, all covered by industrial layer of the Dura Mater. The joint between the bone of the skull, the fibrous joint, call it suture. So we have main suture, that first sagittal suture, second coronal suture, third lambdoid suture, and fourth temporal suture, and have many sutures between the bone of the skulls. The arrangement of cranial fossa. The cranial cavity is divided into 3 cranial fossa. First, anterior cranial fossa, which accommodate the anterior lobe of the brain, call it frontal lobe. Second, middle cranial fossa, which is much wider than the anterior cranial fossa, contain the 2 temporal lobe of the brain. Third, posterior cranial fossa is much shallower and wider than the middle cranial fossa and is accommodate the occipital lobe of the brain. So these 3 cranial fossa that forming the cranial cavity. This figure shows an arrangement of the cranial fossa from anterior to posterior, the anterior cranial fossa and middle cranial fossa and posterior cranial fossa. This figure shows the bones that forming the cranial fossa, the frontal bone, parietal bone, temporal bone, occipital bone, sphenoidal bone, and part of ethmoidal bone that forming the cranial fossa. This figure shows the level of the floor of the cranial fossa. The higher one is the anterior cranial fossa, and then the middle cranial fossa, and the shallower one, the posterior cranial fossa. We start with the anterior cranial fossa. The bone that forming anterior cranial fossa, frontal bone in front, orbital part of frontal bone, cranial plate of ethmoidal bone, lesser wing of sphenoidal bone, and anterior part of the sphenoid bone that forming the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. The boundaries of anterior cranial fossa, anteriorly and laterally by the frontal bone. The floor is contained orbital plate of frontal bone, ethmoid cranial plate of ethmoidal bone, anterior border of sphenoidal sphenoid and lacerum wing of sphenoidal bone and the crista galli. The posterior border of it, posterior border of lacerum wing of sphenoid bone, anterior crinoid process, and sulcus chiasmicus. We have crista galli. It is sharp upward projection of ethmoidal bone in the midline of a cerebral plate of ethmoidal bone for attachment of Falx Cerebri. We have one foramen called foramen cecum. It is small aperture between crista galli and the crest of frontal bone. The foramen cecum, it is the blue line, is from upper part of the nose to superior sagittal sinus. We have small perforation within cribriform plate of ethmoidal bone called foramina of cribriform plate of ethmoidal bone. It is miniature from nasal mucosa to olfactory pulp. With other structure within the anterior cranial fossa, we have Falx Cerebri through the crista galli, Tentorium Cerebelli through the anterior cranial process, and the frontal lobe of the brain. The second fossa is middle cranial fossa. The bones are forming middle cranial fossa. There are lateral wing of sphenoid bone, greater wing of sphenoid bone, anterior cranial process, petrous part of temporal bone, squamous temporal bone, anterior inferior angle of parietal bone, and the body of sphenoid bone. حقيقة البون that forming the middle cranial fossa here, the parietal bone, sphenoidal bone, and temporal bone, that it is forming the middle cranial fossa. This bone is the boundaries of it. The boundaries of middle cranial fossa. Anteriorly, the posterior border of lesser wing of sphenoid bone, anterior cranial processes, and sulcus chiasmicus. Posteriorly, superior border of petrous part of temporal bone and sphenoid dorsum sellae. Laterally, squamous part of temporal bone and some part of parietal and the greater wing of sphenoid bone. The floor of the middle cranial fossa from greater wing of sphenoid bone and petrous squamous part of the temporal bone. In the center, the floor is formed by sellae torsica of body of the sphenoid bone. We have structure within the middle cranial fossa. We start with the superior orbital fissure that is located between the lesser wing of sphenoid bone and the greater wing of sphenoid bone that transmit this structure. First, lacrimal nerve and frontal nerve. We have the trochlear nerve, the third cranial nerve, and subophthalmic vein, meningeal branch of lacrimal artery, and a stomatic branch of middle meningeal artery. The upper and lower division of oculomotor nerve, the fourth cranial nerve, and nasociliary nerve, and abducent nerve, the sixth cranial nerve. The inferior ophthalmic vein and sympathetic nerve from plexus around the internal carotid artery. So we have third, fourth, fifth, and the sixth cranial nerve that pass through the superior orbital fissure. We have three foramini within the floor of the middle cranial fossa within the greater wing of sphenoid bone. The first one is the anterior one, is foramen rotundum. It is small foramini that transmit maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve, the second division of the fifth cranial nerve. Posterior to it, we have larger foramini, is called foramen ovale. It is oval in shape. It transmits the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve, the third division of fifth cranial nerve. And we have lesser petrosal nerve, ascending meningeal artery, emissary vein connecting cavernous sinuses with the pterygoid venous plexus, and anterior trunk of middle meningeal vein. The smallest one and more posterior one is foramen spinosum. It is very small foramini that it is anterior to petrous part of temporal bone. It transmits middle meningeal artery, meningeal branch of mandibular nerve, and posterior trunk of middle meningeal vein. Other foramen is called emissary sphenoidal foramen. It is posterior to the foramen spinosum. It transmits emissary vein connecting cavernous sinuses with the pterygoid venous plexus. Other foramen is called foramen lacerum. It is located between the petrous part of temporal bone and the greater wing of sphenoid bone and the body of the sphenoid bone. It transmits meningeal branch of ascending pharyngeal artery and emissary vein from cavernous sinuses. Other structure, we have carotid canal. Its location between the body of the sphenoid bone and the greater wing of the sphenoid bone. It transmits internal carotid artery and nerve of the pterygoid canal. The structure within the middle cranial fossa. The structure are temporal lobe of the cerebral hemispheres and diaphragma sellae attached to tuberculum sellae. We have hypophysis cerebri on hypophyseal fossa. It is the pituitary gland, called it hypophyseal cerebri, and anterior end of Tentorium Cerebelli and vitrosphenoidal ligament to posterior clinoid process. And we have at the side of the body of the sphenoid bone that have sinus called cavernous sinuses. And the posterior surface of lesser wing of sphenoid bone, we have superior petrosal sinuses. The last fossa is posterior cranial fossa. The bone that forming posterior cranial fossa, the petrous temporal bone, dorsum sellae of sphenoid bone, squamous part of occipital bone, mastoid part of temporal bone, basilar part of occipital bone, and the mastoid angle of parietal bone. So the bone that forming posterior cranial fossa is temporal bone, sphenoidal bone, occipital bone, and part of the parietal bone. The boundaries of posterior cranial fossa. Its boundaries anteriorly superior border of petrous part of temporal bone and dorsum sellae. Posteriorly, the internal surface of squamous part of occipital bone. The floor of the posterior cranial fossa, the basilar part of occipital bone, the squamous and condylar part of occipital bone, and the mastoid part of the temporal bone. We have a larger foramen within the skull, called it foramen magnum, from the central part of the floor of the posterior cranial fossa. We have the structures within the posterior cranial fossa. We start with the jugular foramen. Its location between the petrous part of temporal bone and the condylar part of the occipital bone. It transmits inferior petrosal sinuses, meningeal branch of ascending pharyngeal artery, and 3 cranial nerves, 9th, 10th, 11th cranial nerve. It is glossopharyngeus, vagus, and accessory cranial nerve, and transmit internal jugular vein and meningeal branch of occipital artery. The foramen magnum. It is the larger foramen within the floor of the occipital of the posterior cranial fossa. It transmits apical ligament of dense membrana texture and spinal accessory nerve, vertebral arteries, sympathetic plaques around the vertebral arteries, and posterior spinal arteries and anterior spinal artery. And transmit the lower part of medulla oblongata, the tensity of the cerebellum, and the 3 layer of meninges. Other structure, the hypoglossal canal, that its location between basilar part of the occipital bone and condylar part of occipital bone. It transmits hypoglossal nerve towards cranial nerve and meningeal branch of ascending pharyngeal artery and emissary vein connecting sigmoid sinuses to internal jugular vein. Other structure, posterior condylar canal. It is located between the condylar process of occipital bone and the squamous process of occipital bone. It transmits a mesial vein connecting sigmoid sinus to suboccipital-venous sinuses. The structure within the posterior cranial fossa, the apical ligament of dense membranatic area, follicles of cerebellum, Falx Cerebri, bonus and medulla oblongata, cerebellum of the brain. Now we discuss the meninges, the structure that surrounds the brain. So the meninges of the brain, we have three layers. The outer layer is the Dura Mater, the middle layer, the Arachnoid Mater, the inner layer, the Pia Mater. So the layer of the meninges from outside to inward, the first Dura Mater, Arachnoid Mater, and the Pia Mater. This figure shows the arrangement of the from the skull bone and outside periosteum inside the endosteum, or call it the Dura Mater, and inside to it the Arachnoid Mater, and the matter that surrounding the brain, call it Pia Mater. We start the first layer, outer layer is the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater is conventionally described as two layers, the endosteal layer and meningeal layer. These are closely united except along certain line where they separate to form venous sinuses. The endosteal layer, the outer layer, is nothing more than the ordinary periosteum covering the inner surface of the skull bone. It does not extend to the foramen magnum to become continuous with the Dura Mater of the spinal cord. Around the margin of all foramen in the skull, it becomes continuity with the periosteum on outside of the skull bones. At the suture, it is continuity with the sutural ligament. So the endosteal layer is the same as periosteum from outside of the skull's bone. The second layer, the meningeal layer, is the Dura Mater proper, the real Dura Mater, covering the brain. Is continuous through the foramen magnum with the Dura Mater of spinal cord. It provides tubular sheath for the cranial nerve. Outside the skull, the sheath fuses with the epirhynium of the nerve. We have a certain folding within the Dura Mater. Let's call it dural unfolding. The meningeal layer sends inward four septae that divide the cranial cavity into freely communicating space, loading the subdivision of the brain. The function of this septa is to restrict the rotatory displacement of the brain. We have four folding. The first one, call it Falx Cerebri, second one called Tentorium Cerebelli and Falx Cerebelli, and the last one, call it Diaphragma sellae. We start with the first folding, call it Falx Cerebri. The Falx Cerebri is a sickle-shaped fold of Dura Mater that lie in the midline between the two cerebral hemispheres. Its narrow end in front is attached to internal frontal crest and the crista galli. Its posterior, broad posterior part blend in the midline with the upper surface of Tentorium Cerebelli. The superior sagittal sinus run in the upper fixed margin. The inferior sagittal sinus run in the slower concave free margin, and the straight sinus run along the is attached to Tentorium Cerebelli. The second one, call it Tentorium Cerebelli. The Tentorium Cerebelli is a crescent-shaped fold of Dura Mater that roof over the posterior cranial fossa. It covers the upper surface of cerebellum and supports the occipital loop of the cerebral hemispheres. In front is gap, the tentorial notch. The other structure, called it Falx Cerebelli. The Falx Cerebelli is a small, sickle-shaped fold of Dura Mater that is attached to the internal occipital crest and projects forward between the two cerebral hemispheres. Its posterior fixed margin contains the occipital sinuses. The last one folding is diaphragm sellae. The diaphragm sellae is a small circular fold of Dura Mater that forms the roof or sella turcica. A small opening in its center allows passage of the stalk of the pituitary gland. We have dural nerve supply. The innervation of the Dura Mater, the branch of trigeminal nerve, vagus nerve, the first three cervical nerve, and the branching from sympathetic system pass to the Dura Mater. The blood supply of the Dura Mater. The internal carotid artery, maxillary artery, ascending pharyngeal artery, occipital artery, and vertebral artery. This artery is a branching of the internal carotid artery, external carotid artery, and vertebral artery. From clinical standpoint, the most important is the middle meningeal artery, which is commonly damaged in the head injury and lead to internal hemorrhage of the skull. The second layer is the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is a delicate, impermeable membrane covering the brain and lying between the Pia Mater and internally and the Dura Mater externally. It's separated from Dura Mater by a potential space that called it the subdural space, and from the Pia Mater by the subarachnoid space, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The arachnoid mater fuses with the epirhynium of the nerve at their point of exit from the skull. In the case of optic nerve, the arachnoid form a sheath for the nerve that extends into the orbital cavity through the optic canal and fuse with the sclera of the eyeball. The spaces within the arachnoid mater have above each subdural space, below it subarachnoid space that contain cerebrospinal fluid, and we have arachnoid villi and arachnoid granulation. The inner layer is the Pia Mater. The Pia Mater is a vascular membrane that closely invests the brain, covering the gyri and descending into deepest sulci. It extends over the cranial nerve and fuses with their epirhynium. The cerebral arteries entering the substance of the brain carry a sheet of Pia with them. The meningeal space, that is the dural space, subdural space that extends between the skull and the dural mater. This space that have any injury or fracture to the skull that lead to hemorrhage, call it extradural or epidural hemorrhage. And this is this first space between the meninges. The second space that is dura-arachnoid and call it subdural space. The third space is arachnoid pia, or call it subarachnoid space that located between the arachnoid mater and Pia Mater. The brain within the cranial fossa. This figure shows the brain and its structure that accommodate within anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. The anterior cranial fossa that accommodate the frontal lobe, the middle cranial fossa that accommodate the temporal lobe, and the posterior cranial fossa that accommodate the occipital cranial lobe and the cerebellum and the brainstem. Thank you for your listening to this lecture.